The lantern light in the Culver County courthouse flickered twice before Lydia Talmadge slammed both palms flat on the long oak table and stared down the row of men who had spent the last 20 minutes calling her a liar. "You want to test me?" Her voice was low and controlled, the way a river sounds just before it crests its banks. "Then test me, right now, in front of every soul in this room." Sheriff Burrell hadn't leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers over his considerable stomach. He had the look of a man who had never once been proven wrong in public and did not intend to start tonight. Behind him, the iron safe that housed the town's official record books gaped open like a wound. The leather-bound volumes inside were gone, every single one of them. Birth records, land deeds, property transfers, marriage certificates, water rights, grazing agreements, all of it, vanished between midnight and the first gray light of dawn. And seated at the far end of the table, with sawdust on the knees of his trousers and the look of a man who had not slept in 2 days, was Phineas Shepard. He said nothing. He just watched her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and Lydia could not yet determine whether he was watching her the way a man watches a wildfire he admires or a wildfire he fears. "Miss Talmadge," said Alderman Preston Fitch, drumming his soft fingers on the tabletop, "the official record books of Culver County, New Mexico Territory, have been stolen. Every land deed this county has produced since 1871 is gone. Without those documents, half the land titles in this territory revert to disputed status under federal law. The Hargrove Land Company arrives on the Thursday stage with their attorney and their competing claims, and we have exactly 4 days to prove that the legitimate settlers of this county established their holdings before Hargrove's fraudulent filing date." He paused. He let that sink in. "What we do not need is a schoolteacher telling us she remembers what was in those books." "I do not just remember what was in those books," Lydia said quietly. "I remember every single entry in those books, word for word, date for date, parcel boundary for parcel boundary." The room went so silent that Lydia could hear the moths throwing themselves against the glass of the lantern. Phineas Shepard straightened in his chair. She had taught school in Culver for 3 years. She had arrived in the fall of 1880, 24 years old, with a teaching certificate from the normal school in Cincinnati, a trunk full of books, and a peculiar gift that she had spent most of her life carefully hiding because the people around her tended to find it unsettling rather than useful. She could read something once and hold it, whole and perfect, in her mind forever. Every word in sequence, every numeral exactly as written. It was not magic and it was not a trick. It was simply the way her mind had always worked, the way some men could tell direction from stars or read weather in the color of a cloud. She had used it to become the finest student in every school she had ever attended. She had used it to memorize every law book she could get her hands on in Cincinnati, because she had briefly and foolishly considered studying law before she understood that the territory of New Mexico in the year 1883 had exactly no use for a female attorney. So she had become a schoolteacher instead, which at least gave her a room of her own and a reason to keep reading. She had read the Culver County record books because they were kept in the schoolhouse for 6 months in 1881, when the courthouse roof needed replacing, and there was nowhere else safe to store them. The county clerk, old Gerald Matties, had asked her to keep an eye on them. She had kept both eyes on them. She had read every single page, and every single page had stayed with her, clear and permanent as words cut into stone. But that was not where the story began, not really. The story began 3 weeks before the night the record books disappeared, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when a man rode into Culver on a big bay horse and stopped in front of the general store with the look of a man who had not arrived by accident. Phineas Shepard was 31 years old and had the kind of face that the territory carved on the men it decided to keep weathered and precise, jaw like a bluff edge, eyes the color of creek water in September, dark with depth and a certain waiting quality. He wore no badge. He carried a Winchester repeating rifle in the saddle scabbard and a Colt single-action Army revolver on his right hip, and he wore both with the ease of a man who had grown up understanding that the frontier was not a romantic notion, but a fact that would kill you if you stopped paying attention. He was a range detective. He worked for himself, contracted out to territorial landowners, cattlemen's associations, and on one occasion the U.S. Marshals Service when they needed someone who could move quietly across country that badges could not. He had been hired, he would tell Lydia much later, by a coalition of 7 ranching families in Culver County who had gotten wind 6 weeks earlier that the Hargrove Land Company out of Santa Fe was preparing a legal assault on the county's land records. They had hired Phineas to come and assess the threat before it materialized. He had arrived 3 weeks before it materialized. He had been too late to prevent the theft, but that, as it turned out, was not going to matter in the way anyone expected. The first time Lydia saw him, she was standing outside the schoolhouse ringing the brass handbell to call her students in from noon recess, and he was tying his horse to the rail in front of the general store. He looked across the street. She looked across the street. They held each other's gaze for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to be interesting, and then Lydia went back inside to teach arithmetic to 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 15. Because she was a professional, and she did not moon over strangers in the middle of the school day. She noticed him again that evening at Dora Pickwell's boarding house, where Lydia took her suppers. He was at the far end of the table, eating fried salt pork and biscuits with methodical efficiency, listening to old Dora's accounting of county gossip with the polite but focused attention of a man who was actually paying attention for professional reasons. When Dora introduced them across the length of the table, he said, "Miss Talmadge," with a small nod and nothing more. Lydia said, "Mr. Shepard," with equivalent economy, and they went on eating, but she noticed the way he listened. Not the glassy, patient listening of a man enduring conversation, but the sharp, cataloging attention of someone filing information away for use. It reminded her, uncomfortably, of herself. Culver, New Mexico Territory, in the fall of 1883 was a town of roughly 400 souls, strung along the dry bed of the Pedra Creek Wash where it flattened out between 2 red mesa ridges. It had a courthouse, a school, a church of ambiguous denomination, 4 saloons, a livery, a blacksmith, a general store, a doctor's office, a land agent's office, and Dora Pickwell's boarding house. The surrounding county was cattle and sheep country, with a few small farming operations along the creek bottom, and the question of who owned which piece of land had always been the primary source of conflict, because water was scarce and grazing land was finite, and men had short tempers and long memories about both. The Hargrove Land Company was not a local conflict. It was a different category of danger entirely. Its principal, a man named Cyrus Hargrove, had developed a technique in the preceding decade for identifying counties with imprecise early land records, manufacturing competing claims through fraudulent survey filings with the territorial government in Santa Fe, and then arriving with attorneys and enough political connections to paralyze the local courts until legitimate landowners either sold out cheaply or spent themselves into ruin fighting the claims. He had done it in 3 counties already. He was very good at it. What Phineas had understood when he took the job, and what he had spent his first 2 weeks in Culver trying to assess, was whether Culver County's records were solid enough to withstand Hargrove's assault. The answer, he had concluded, was that they were adequate but not unassailable. Gerald Matties had kept reasonably careful records, but there were gaps in the 1872 survey chain and a set of ambiguous boundary descriptions in the 1876 water rights filings that a skilled attorney could work with. Then someone had stolen all the records, and the question of their quality became suddenly irrelevant. Lydia had not been at the boarding house supper the evening before the theft was discovered. She had been at the schoolhouse late, preparing a geography lesson that involved a hand-drawn map of the territories, which she was rendering on a large sheet of brown paper with a careful hand, and a bottle of India ink. She had heard nothing in the night. She had seen no one come or go from the courthouse, which was across the wide main street and 2 lots down. The alarm was raised at sunup by the county clerk, a young man named Tobias Reeve, who had taken over from old Gerald Matties the previous year, when Matties had gone to live with his daughter in Albuquerque. Tobias had arrived to open the courthouse and found the rear window forced, the safe blown with a small charge that had left a scorch mark on the floor and a smell of sulfur in the air, and the records gone. He had run directly to Sheriff Burl Haddon's house in his shirt sleeves. By the time Lydia arrived at the courthouse that morning, summoned like most of the town by the simple mechanism of a community small enough that news traveled at the speed of a running man, Phineas Shepard was already there, crouched by the rear window with his eyes moving over the sill and the ground outside with the focused, unhurried attention that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. He had looked up when she arrived, and something in his expression had shifted just slightly in a way she could not immediately interpret. She learned the scope of the theft. She understood immediately what it meant for the county. And then she stood quietly in the back of the gathering crowd and did what she always did when she was thinking seriously, which was go very still and let her mind work. The record books had been in the courthouse for the past 2 years. She had read them when they were in the schoolhouse. The question was whether what she remembered was precise enough to reconstruct them as legal documents. She knew it was. She also knew that saying so, in a room full of frightened men who had never encountered the specific thing her memory could do, was going to require a certain amount of patience and a willingness to be doubted. She had not expected the level of hostility that came from Alderman Fitch, who seemed personally offended by the suggestion that a woman's recollection could serve as a legal substitute for official documentation. She had not expected the weary skepticism from Sheriff Haddon, who was not a cruel man but was a thoroughly conventional one. What she had not expected was the question from Phineas Shepard, delivered from the far end of the table in a voice that was quiet and direct and completely devoid of condescension. "Miss Talmadge," he said, "tell me the acreage and boundary description on the Sutton grazing lease, the one filed in 1878. The room shifted its attention. Several of the men present knew the Sutton property. If she was wrong, they would know it. Lydia folded her hands on the table. She opened the relevant page in her memory the way another person might open a book, and she read from it as fluently as if the leather-bound volume were in front of her. Sutton, R.H. and Sons, grazing lease recorded October 14, 1878. Parcel commencing at the northeast corner of Section 12, Township 7 South, Range 14 east of the New Mexico Principal Meridian. Thence south along the eastern boundary of said section for a distance of 1 mile, 240 yards. Thence west for a distance of 1/2 mile. Thence north to the section line. Thence east along the section line to the point of commencement. Total acreage 467 acres. Witnessed by Gerald Matties, county clerk, and by Deputy Marshal Thomas Fried. She paused. There is a notation in the margin, written in Mr. Matties's hand, that the northeast corner stake was a pine post set 2 feet deep, blazed on the west face. She stopped speaking. The silence in the room was of a different quality than it had been 30 seconds before. Robert Sutton, a lean rancher in his 50s who had been sitting with his hat on his knee and the expression of a man preparing to lose everything, slowly put his hat on the table and stared at her. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right. I was there when old Gerald wrote it up." The pine post. He looked around the table. "She's right." Phineas Shepard's dark eyes were fixed on Lydia's face with an expression that she could not quite categorize. It was not the stunned blankness of a man who had been surprised. It was something more deliberate than that, a focused reassessment, as if he were a surveyor who had just been handed a different instrument and was reconsidering the entire landscape in light of it. "How many entries are in those books?" he asked. "Across all 7 volumes there are 412 individual entries," Lydia said. 48 are land deeds, 63 are grazing leases, 57 are water rights filings, 94 are birth and death records. The remaining entries are marriage certificates, business licenses, tax assessments, and miscellaneous official correspondence. Phineas sat back slowly. He rubbed the side of his jaw with 2 fingers and she watched him recalibrate. Alderman Fitch made a sound that was not quite a dismissal and not quite acceptance. "This is highly irregular," he said. "Testimony from memory cannot substitute for original documents under territorial law." "Not alone," Lydia agreed, because she had already thought this through. "But the Organic Act of New Mexico Territory allows for the reconstruction of lost public records through the sworn affidavit testimony of credible witnesses when original documents are destroyed or stolen, provided the testimony can be corroborated by any independent physical evidence." The relevant section is Chapter 4, Paragraph 19, as amended in 1880. She held Fitch's gaze. "I read the territorial statutes 3 years ago. I remember them." Fitch opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at Sheriff Haddon with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the floor he thought was solid was, in fact, a trapdoor. Phineas, she noticed, almost smiled. That almost smile did something to Lydia that she was not prepared for. Not because it was charming, though it was, in its restrained and reluctant way, but because it was the smile of a man who recognized something, not the performance of a woman trying to impress a room. The actual fact of a mind encountering another mind of comparable precision. She had not been smiled at that way very often. She deliberately looked away from him and addressed the room. "I can reconstruct every entry in those books," she said. "It will take me approximately 4 days working steadily, which is precisely how long we have before the Hargrove attorneys arrive. What I need is a scribe to write as I dictate, because writing out 412 entries myself, in addition to teaching school, will not leave sufficient time. I need Mr. Reeves' cooperation as current county clerk to certify each entry as I produce it. And I need someone to ride to any of the property owners represented in these records and collect any personal copies, receipts, or correspondence that might serve as corroborating evidence for as many entries as possible." She paused. "That last job," said Phineas Shepard, "is what I'm here for." She looked at him directly. He met her gaze with that same steady, considering quality, and this time she let herself notice that the consideration was not hostile or skeptical. He had tested her with the Sutton entry, and she had answered without hesitation and without error, and he had simply and cleanly updated his understanding of what she was. The ease of that recalibration was, she thought, the mark of an honest mind. "Then we have a plan," she said. What followed were 4 days that Lydia would think about for the rest of her life, not because of the legal battle, though that was real enough, but because of what grew between her and Phineas Shepard in the hours and miles and conversations that went into those days like water going into dry ground. The first morning, they sat across from each other at the long table in the courthouse, with Tobias Reeve between them, and a stack of fresh foolscap paper, and Lydia began to dictate. She started with the land deeds because they were the most legally critical and she wanted to establish a rhythm. Tobias wrote and she spoke, and Phineas listened with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between her face and the paper, and she was aware of his attention the way she was aware of weather, as a pressure change, as something that affected the quality of the air. After 2 hours, Tobias's hand cramped and he needed a rest, and Phineas took up the pen without being asked. His handwriting was a surprise. She had expected the cramped, functional script of a man who used writing as pure utility. What she got was a precise, upright hand with clean letter formation and consistent spacing, the handwriting of someone who had been taught carefully and had maintained the habit. She noted it and said nothing. He noted that she noted it and said nothing either. They developed a working rhythm quickly, naturally, the way 2 people with compatible minds and a shared urgent purpose sometimes do. She would begin an entry. He would write and ask no questions unless something was genuinely ambiguous, and his questions, when they came, were intelligent and to the point, focused on legal precision rather than skepticism about her recall. When she said, "The second witness signature on this entry is illegible in the original. I cannot reproduce an illegible signature accurately," he simply wrote "signature illegible" in brackets and moved on without making an issue of it. She appreciated that. She also appreciated, more than she had expected to, that he did not treat the process of sitting in a courthouse writing for a schoolteacher as beneath him. Men of his particular kind, capable and physical, and accustomed to being the most useful person in any given dangerous situation, sometimes had a difficult time in situations where the most useful thing to do was sit quietly and write. Phineas simply sat and wrote, with complete focus and no visible impatience, and she found this more attractive than she had any immediate business finding it. Between sessions, while Tobias recovered and Phineas prepared for his afternoon rides to collect corroborating evidence from landowners, they talked. Not about themselves at first, about the problem. He had been thorough in his preliminary work before the theft, and he had information about the Hargrove operation that she lacked, and she had the entire legal content of the record books in her head, and together they could map the specific vulnerabilities that Hargrove's attorneys were likely to attack. They spent an hour on the first afternoon going through every entry that touched on boundary descriptions or water rights, and Phineas identified the ones he had already flagged as legally weak, and Lydia told him what she remembered about the original survey notations, and between her memory and his knowledge of surveying practice, they were able to identify 3 entries that were going to need additional supporting documentation beyond her testimony. "The carver water right," he said, tapping the paper. "The original survey chain on this one was incomplete. If I can find anyone who was present at the original survey and will swear to it, we can patch the gap." "Do you know who surveyed that section?" "Amos Purdy," she said immediately. "He signed as surveyor on all the 1874 water filings. He was the county surveyor until 1876. Is he still alive?" "He moved to Las Cruces in 1879. I have no information after that." Phineas made a note. "I'll send a wire." He looked up. "How do you do it, if you don't mind my asking?" She considered the question. Most people asked it with a note of something she could only describe as acquisitive unease, as if her answer might reveal that the thing was somehow cheatable, that she had some technique they could apply, and it was not simply a capacity she had been born with. He asked it with straightforward curiosity. "I don't entirely know," she said honestly. "I read something and it stays. The way a tune stays in your head after you've heard it, except much more precise and permanent. I can read the text back to myself in my mind exactly as it was on the page, including the position on the page, the spacing, whether a word was crowded into a margin." He was quiet for a moment. "That must be a strange thing to carry." "Sometimes," she said. "It is occasionally useful." He did not laugh at that, which was the right response. He gave her a brief, acknowledging expression that was close to a smile without quite being one. She was beginning to understand that this was his version of warmth. He rode out that afternoon to the 4 nearest ranches, collecting receipts and personal copies of deeds from men who had kept them, as responsible landowners did, in their personal papers. He was back by suppertime with a saddlebag half full of crumpled, folded documents that he spread on the courthouse table and compared systematically against what they had produced that day. The corroboration rate was high. Every entry he could check against a personal copy matched exactly what Lydia had dictated. At supper at the boarding house that evening, Dora Pickwell watched the two of them over the rim of her coffee cup with an expression of active speculative interest that she did not bother to conceal. Dora was 63 years old and had been running the boarding house since before the town had a name, and she regarded the romantic affairs of her boarders the way a cattleman regarded his herd, with a mixture of fond proprietorship and frank assessment. "You two seem to be getting on," she observed, into a pause in the conversation. Lydia said, "We're working," with dignity. Phineas said nothing, but his eyes moved briefly to Lydia's face in a way that Dora, who was watching carefully, filed away for later. The second day was harder. The material was more complex, with the water rights filings requiring precise technical language that she needed to deliver slowly for Phineas to transcribe accurately, and the session was long and the courthouse was hot. They worked through the noon hour without stopping, and somewhere in the early afternoon, when Tobias had gone to the privy and it was just the two of them at the long table, Phineas put down the pen and looked at her. "May I ask you something personal?" She was not sure she had expected that from this particular man. "You may." "How is it that you're here?" he said. "In Culver, a woman with your capacities, your memory, your knowledge of the law, you could have gone east, you could have taught at a university, you could have done almost anything you chose." She was quiet for a moment. The question was not unkind, but it touched something. "I was engaged to be married," she said. "In Cincinnati." He was a lawyer. "When I showed him what I could do with memory, he was threatened by it instead of interested in it. He told me I should not display it in public because it made other people uncomfortable." She paused. "He meant it made him uncomfortable. We ended the engagement. The teaching position in Culver was offered to me shortly after, and I took it because it was somewhere to go that was not Cincinnati." She said it matter-of-factly, because it was true and she had made her peace with it. But she watched his face as she said it, and she saw the very slight tightening around his eyes that told her he found the behavior of her former fiancé genuinely contemptible. "His loss," Phineas said, and picked up the pen again. "It was not much. It was 4 words and a resumed activity." But Lydia had learned, in 3 years of paying attention to this particular kind of man, that what he did not amplify was often more sincere than what another man would have made into a speech. She turned back to her work, and if the inside of her chest felt slightly different than it had a moment before, she attributed it to the heat. That evening, after supper, Phineas asked her to walk with him. Not the way a man asks a woman to walk when he is performing a courtship ritual, but directly, as if it were a working matter. "I want to show you what I found at the Hargrove man's camp today," he said, because there was a Hargrove man in Culver already. Had been for at least a week, a thin, watchful fellow named Otis Dean who wore his city clothes like a costume and had been staying at the saloon under the pretense of being a cattle buyer. Phineas had identified him on his second day in town and had been keeping a peripheral eye on him ever since. They walked along the creek bed in the last of the evening light, far enough from the main street that their conversation was private, and he told her what he had found when he had, very carefully and entirely illegally, searched Dean's room at the saloon that afternoon while Dean was eating supper. He had found a set of maps, territorial survey maps, but with penciled annotations that matched no legitimate survey notation he had ever seen. The annotations marked specific parcels of land in Culver County with numbers that corresponded, he believed, to a set of competing deed filings that Hargrove's attorneys were preparing to present in Santa Fe. "They didn't steal the records just to deprive us of them," he said. "They stole them so they could alter the disputed entries before putting them back." Lydia stopped walking. "They intend to return them, altered versions, which would then constitute the official record." He looked at her steadily. "Your testimony and the corroborating copies would be the only thing standing between their altered record and legal legitimacy." The implications settled over her like cold water. "And if they knew I had this memory and intended to use it, you would become a problem that needed solving," he said. He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said most things, but she saw in his face something that was not plain at all, something that had become personal for him in a way that went beyond the professional scope of his contract. She did not look away from him. "Are you telling me I'm in danger?" "I'm telling you I'm not going to let you be in danger," he said. It came out quieter than he had perhaps intended it, and she saw him register that, the slight, involuntary directness of it, and not take it back. They stood there by the dry creek bed in the last copper light of the evening, and between them something happened that was not yet anything they could name, but was already more than what it had been that morning. "Thank you," she said, just as quietly. He nodded, and they walked back toward the lights of the town, and neither of them said anything else, but the silence was the kind that has warmth in it. On the morning of the third day, Otis Dean was gone from the saloon, and the Hargrove stage arrived a full day early. There were 3 of them on it. The attorney, a large man named Whitfield Crane from Santa Fe, with an expensive suit and the well-fed confidence of a man who had won in court many times. A second attorney, younger and quieter, and Cyrus Hargrove himself, which was not what anyone had expected, a man of perhaps 55 with a silver-edged hat and the pleasant, direct manner of someone who has spent decades being dangerous while appearing reasonable. They did not go to the courthouse first. They went to Sheriff Haddon, and within an hour of their arrival, Sheriff Haddon had convened an emergency session of the county commission to discuss the filing of Hargrove's competing claims under the territorial land adjudication procedure. Phineas came to find Lydia at the schoolhouse. She was in the middle of a grammar lesson. He waited at the back of the room, hat in his hand, and when she looked at him, she knew from his face that the timeline had changed. "Class," she said with complete composure, "please take out your readers and continue to page 47. I will be back in 5 minutes." She walked to the back of the room, and he told her quietly and efficiently what had happened. "How much of the reconstruction is complete?" he asked. "The land deeds, grazing leases, and water rights are complete," she said. "That is 168 entries. The birth and death records are less legally critical. If I can file the completed entries with Tobias today as a certified declaration, we have the core of a legal response." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw in his eyes something that was almost relief, and underneath it something more tender than relief, and she felt her heart do something she had not given it permission to do. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'll get us in front of the commission this afternoon." He did. It took leverage she did not ask him to detail, and would learn only later had involved Phineas demonstrating to Sheriff Haddon, privately and with specific evidence, that Otis Dean had been in communication with the county clerk's predecessor about the location of the courthouse safe mechanism, which constituted criminal conspiracy, and reflected directly on the credibility of any Hargrove claim to acting in good faith. Haddon, who was conventional but not corrupt, had responded to this information with the galvanized efficiency of a man who understood that his legacy was on a knife edge. The afternoon session of the county commission was the most extraordinary thing Lydia had ever participated in. Crane, the Hargrove attorney, presented his client's competing claims with practiced fluency. He noted the absence of original records. He noted that in their absence, the Hargrove filings, which were on record with the territorial government in Santa Fe, represented the only available documented claims. He was smooth and confident and very, very good. Then Alderman Fitch, who had done a complete reversal from the first meeting once the political calculus had become clear to him, introduced Lydia's certified declaration of reconstructed records, notarized by 3 commission members, and accompanied by 47 corroborating personal copies collected by Phineas from landowners across the county. Crane objected. He objected loudly and at length, citing irregularity, lack of precedent, and the improbability of the underlying claim, which he described, with condescending precision, as the alleged photographic memory of a schoolteacher. Lydia stood. "Counsel," she said, in the same voice she used when a student at the back of the classroom was being inattentive, "I invite you to test the claim. Choose any entry from any of the documents your client has on record in Santa Fe. Ask me to recite it. If I cannot, your objection stands." Crane stared at her. Hargrove, at the back of the room, was watching her with an expression she could not read. Crane reached into his case and produced a document. He read from it without looking up. March 3, 1877. Water rights assignment, Upper Pedra Creek, Northern Branch. Grantor CL. Whitmore, 140 acres water rights, Upper Pedra Creek, Northern Branch, commencing at the natural rock formation known locally as Splitnose Mesa, and extending downstream for a distance of 3 miles along the northern channel, Lydia said. Grantee, the Culver County Irrigation Cooperative, represented by Thomas Barrow, President. Consideration, $12. Filed with the county clerk March 3, 1877, witnessed by Gerald Matties and Deputy James Cole. She paused. There is also a notation in the margin referencing a prior informal agreement dated 1875 that was superseded by this filing. The Hargrove document you are holding does not include that notation. Crane looked up from his document. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. The notation, she continued, is legally significant because the 1875 informal agreement contained a clause that prevented the assignment of water rights downstream of Splitnose Mesa to any commercial entity for a period of 25 years from the date of that original agreement. Your client's competing claim attempts to assert commercial water rights on this exact parcel. A notation omitted from the Hargrove filing but present in the original and in my testimony would make that claim void. The room was completely silent. Crane sat down slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man recalibrating a great many things at once. Hargrove rose from his seat at the back of the room. For a moment he simply stood there, looking at Lydia, with the expression of a man who had built his enterprise on the calculated certainty that certain advantages would never actually be challenged. Then he put on his hat and walked out of the room. In the absence of its principal, and with the corroborating documentary evidence and Lydia's certified declaration now entered into the proceedings, Crane's opposition collapsed with the particular deflation of a legal position that was always going to fail, but had counted on never being properly opposed. The commission voted. The reconstructed records were accepted as legally binding for the purpose of establishing county claims under the territorial adjudication procedure. The Hargrove competing claims were referred to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation of possible fraud in their original filing. It was not over, technically. There would be correspondence and filings and the matter of the actual stolen record books, which needed to be found. But the immediate crisis was resolved. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the long afternoon light that turned the red mesa ridges to copper and made the dust in the air look like suspended gold, Phineas found her. He did not say anything for a moment. He stood beside her on the steps and they looked out at the street together, and she could feel the warmth of him beside her, the solid, quiet fact of his presence, and she was conscious of an almost painful happiness that she was not entirely sure how to put down anywhere. "You knew about the 1875 agreement," he said. "You were holding that." "I was waiting to see if it was needed," she said. "You were waiting to use it where it would do the most damage." "I prefer the word impact," she said. He turned and looked at her, and this time he fully smiled. It was a rare thing, that full smile, and it was more than worth the wait. It rearranged his whole face into something that was still entirely itself but warmer, more open, as if a window had been unlatched in a room that had always been slightly shut. "Miss Talmadge," he said, "I have ridden across 4 territories in the course of my work and encountered a considerable number of situations where the outcome depended on someone doing something exceptional. What you did in that room today is among the most remarkable things I have witnessed." She felt heat in her face that was not the afternoon sun, and she was aware of herself strongly enough not to hide it. "I had good support," she said. "The corroborating documents you collected were essential. Without physical corroboration, my testimony alone would not have been sufficient under the statute." He shook his head slightly. "You know that's not what decided it." She did know. The 1875 clause had decided it, and the 1875 clause existed in her memory and nowhere else, because it was in a marginal notation that even Gerald Matties had probably forgotten he'd written and that no personal copy would have captured. "It was a team effort," she said, because she believed that too. He looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, "May I call on you properly this evening, not about the records?" She held his gaze. Her heart was doing the thing again. "Yes," she said, "you may." He nodded with that same precision of movement that she had come to understand as his version of eloquence, and walked down the steps toward his horse. That evening was different from the working evenings that had preceded it. He came to the boarding house parlor at 7 o'clock with his hat in his hand, and an expression of determined composure that Dora Pickwell, who managed to be present in the hallway for the first 30 seconds before the requirements of dignity expelled her, described to her cat afterward as a man meeting his match and knowing it. They sat in the parlor. It was a small room with heavy curtains, and a lamp that made warm circles of light on the rag rug. There was a decorum to it that both of them observed and both of them felt, at some level, was almost beside the point, because the important things had already been established in the courthouse and on the creek bed, and in the 4 days of working together at the long table with the lamplight and the foolscap and the scratch of a pen. He told her about himself in the deliberate, methodical way he did everything. Born in Missouri in 1852, grew up on a cattle farm. Served as a scout in the last period of the Apache campaigns, which he described with the unflinching plainness of a man who had seen injustice done in those engagements, and had spent years since working out what he thought about it. The scouts had done their work with skill and loyalty, and the communities they had been drawn from had been treated with systematic disregard by the same government that used them. And Phineas spoke about this not with performance, but with the quiet conviction of a man who has thought about something until he understands it. After the scouts, a period of working cattle, then drifting into the range detective work that suited his particular set of abilities, which included tracking, observation, a certain facility with the kind of persuasion that does not require raised voices, and a tolerance for solitude that made the itinerant nature of the work more sustainable than it might have been for a different kind of man. No family currently. His mother had died in 1875. His father had been gone long before that, vanished into the westward migration with the cheerful irresponsibility of a man who loved the horizon more than anything rooted. He said this without bitterness, but also without sentimentality. "What do you want?" Lydia asked, because they were past the kind of conversation where that question was presumptuous. "Not what you have, what you want." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Something permanent," he said, "something that stays." She understood that. She understood it from a place in herself that she rarely examined, because it was the place that contained the years of making herself useful in rooms full of people who found her unsettling, and the engagement that had ended because she was too much, and the choice of a small western town at the edge of the territory, because it was somewhere she could be left alone to be exactly what she was without being required to apologize for it. "I'm not going to be manageable," she said. "If that is what you mean by permanent." "I know," he said. "I don't want managed, I want—" He stopped. He looked at the lamp, then he looked at her. "I want someone whose mind I will never finish being astonished by." The words hung between them in the warm lamplight, and Lydia felt something in her that had been braced for a long time loosen its grip. "That is a reasonable want," she said, very quietly. "Yes," he said. "I thought so." They were quiet together for a few moments, and the quietness was not uncomfortable. Outside, Culver went about its evening business, horses at rails and light from the saloons and the distant sound of someone playing a mouth organ badly. The territory did not pause for parlor conversations of any significance. It went on being what it was, indifferent and magnificent, and full of the particular promise that draws certain kinds of people to difficult places. "I'm not going to stop teaching," she said. "I wouldn't ask you to. And I intend to finish that reconstructed record, all 412 entries, even the birth records. The town deserves a complete document." "I know," he said. "I'll keep writing out for corroborating copies until the week is done." She looked at him. He looked at her. and something passed between them that was an agreement more binding than most of the legal documents she had spent 4 days reconstructing from memory. He left at 9 o'clock because he had an early start the following morning, heading out east to the Terwilliger and Barrow ranches for the last of the corroborating documents. At the parlor door he paused. "Miss Talmadge," he stopped. "Lydia," she said. He stood with that for a moment, and the way his expression changed when she said it was something she put into her memory with the same perfect clarity that she retained everything else, because she knew immediately that she would want it there for a long time. "Lydia," he said. "Good night." "Good night, Phineas," she said. The following day, the fourth and final day before the original crisis deadline that circumstances had overtaken, the stolen record books were found. Phineas had sent word via Tobias Reeve to a contact he had in the Santa Fe Marshal's office, a deputy marshal named Calloway who knew the Hargrove operation and had been looking for grounds to act on for some time. With the county commission's resolution and the referral to the territorial attorney general, Calloway had had enough. He had moved on Otis Dean, who had made it only as far as Bernalillo before being overtaken by a deputy riding express. The 7 volumes of Culver County records were found in a wooden crate in Dean's hired wagon, not yet altered, because Dean had been waiting for specific instructions from the Santa Fe office that had never arrived in time. They were returned to Culver on the afternoon stage, in the care of Calloway's deputy, who turned them over to Sheriff Haddon with a set of official papers from the territorial marshal's office that effectively ended the Hargrove claim to Culver County. The town turned out for the return of the record books in the way that small western communities turn out for events of genuine collective significance, which is to say without any formal organization, but with complete thoroughness. People came from the surrounding ranches and farms, arriving throughout the afternoon in wagons and on horseback, and gathered in the street in front of the courthouse, with the particular combination of relief and celebration that follows a serious crisis properly averted. Lydia received more credit than she felt was strictly hers, because the whole town now knew what she had done, in the way that things became known in small communities with astonishing speed and minimal factual distortion. Several of the ranchers whose properties had been at stake came to shake her hand with an awkward sincerity that she found deeply touching. Robert Sutton, the rancher whose grazing lease she had recalled in the initial confrontation, brought her a jar of his wife's preserved peaches and could not quite find enough words, so he just held out the jar and nodded repeatedly, and she accepted it with more genuine warmth than she felt for any of the speeches. Alderman Fitch made a speech. It was long and contained several sentences that reformulated his initial hostility as cautious prudence, which Lydia let pass without comment because she had won, and she was not interested in the additional labor of making Fitch feel smaller than he already did. Phineas stood at the edge of the crowd and watched her, and when she looked up from the third conversation of the afternoon and found his eyes across the width of the street, the expression in them was the one she was putting into permanent memory. It was over for the town. It was beginning for them. The weeks that followed had a quality that Lydia would later describe to herself as the feeling of a life rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. Her teaching continued. Her students noticed she was happier than she had been and took appropriate advantage of it in ways that required correction. And she continued to work on the full 412-entry reconstruction, not because it was legally necessary now that the original books had been returned, but because she intended to present it to the county as a certified duplicate, which any competent archivist would have told them they should have made years ago. Phineas did not immediately leave Culver, though his contract with the ranching families was technically complete. He stayed on, which he managed to make look like professional follow-up on the Hargrove matter, which it partly was, and which the ranching families were happy to continue paying him for, which he allowed them to do without discomfort because a man needed to eat. What it actually was that he was not ready to leave, and he was not the kind of man who lied to himself about his reasons for things. He called on her twice more in the boarding house parlor. He found reasons to bring documents to the schoolhouse in the late afternoons when the children had gone home. He rode with her on a Sunday to the site of the split-nose Mesa water rights she had cited in the commission session, because she had read so much about it and never seen it, and the actual rock formation, a great split-faced bluff above the dry bed of the Pedra Creek northern branch, was more impressive than the notation that had saved the county's water claims, which had rather understated it. They sat on their horses at the edge of the mesa and looked at the country spread out below them, the red and ochre land with its thin lines of possible green where water ran or had run, and she thought about how the land looked exactly like the records described it, precise and actual, and he said, without looking at her, "I've been thinking about staying." "Staying," she repeated carefully. "In Culver." He looked at her now. "There's work here. The county needs someone with experience in range law and property disputes on an ongoing basis. More towns are going to face what this one just faced as the land companies move in. Someone ought to be here who knows how to oppose them." He paused. "That is a completely accurate description of a professional calculation." "It is," she agreed. "It is also not the entire calculation." She looked at him steadily. The wind was moving across the mesa top and lifting the edge of her bonnet, and the light was the enormous, undifferentiated brightness of a New Mexico afternoon, and she thought that the country was very beautiful and that she had not noticed it quite this much before. "What is the rest of the calculation?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, not with the testing attention of that first confrontation, not with the professional assessment of the courthouse sessions. With something that had moved all the way past assessment into something simpler and more permanent. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with the intention of marriage if you're willing to consider it. I understand that's a significant thing to say to a woman who values her independence and her work, and I mean to respect both, but I believe in saying what I mean." Lydia was quiet for a moment. Around them the mesa top was silent except for the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. "I appreciate directness," she said. "I know," he said. "That's partly why I'm using it." She looked at the country below them, and at the rock formation that had been a notation in her memory and was now a real place she had ridden to with a real man on a real afternoon, and she thought about permanence and what it required and what it offered in return. "Yes," she said, "I am willing to consider it." He nodded with that precise economy that she had learned to translate accurately. It meant yes and good, and I am very glad, and a number of other things besides. He did court her properly. By the standards of Culver, New Mexico territory, in the autumn and early winter of 1883, this meant calling at the boarding house, riding together on Sundays, and being seen sufficiently often in each other's company that the community had adequate time to adjust its expectations. Dora Pickwell adjusted hers with the speed of a woman who had already expected it. The town, collectively, was delighted. The schoolteacher who had saved their land records had, in the process, acquired a companion of obvious capability and equal obvious devotion, and Culver was the kind of community that understood the value of both. The 7 ranching families who had contracted Phineas were particularly satisfied, having received not only professional service, but what they somewhat proprietorially considered a local institution. In December, on a cold evening with snow on the mesa ridges and the first real bite of winter in the air, Phineas asked her formally, in the boarding house parlor, with a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet that he had carried in the bottom of his saddlebag since her death because he had not known what to do with it, but had known it meant something. She said yes without any hesitation, which was the first time in their entire acquaintance that she had answered a significant question without a pause for consideration, and he marked this as separately meaningful in his own quiet way. They were married in February of 1884, in the church of ambiguous denomination, by a minister who had come down from Albuquerque for the occasion because Culver's own itinerant preacher was somewhere in Arizona and not expected back until spring. The weather was cold and brilliant, with the red mesas sharp against a sky the color of a deep-water well, and nearly everyone in the county came, including Robert Sutton and his wife who brought more preserved peaches, and Tobias Reeve, who cried a little and was not ashamed of it, and old Dora Pickwell, who wore her best dress and watched the proceedings with the serene satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something for months and is now receiving the confirmation. Lydia wore a blue wool dress she had ordered from a catalog out of Denver because it was the finest ready-made garment available to her in the territory, and she believed that a woman should dress deliberately for occasions of significance. Her dark hair was pinned with care. She carried no flowers because it was February in New Mexico and there were no flowers, and she would not carry artificial ones because the artifice seemed wrong for the moment. So she carried instead a small volume of poetry that had been her mother's and that she loved, which was both practical and entirely herself. And Phineas, when he saw her walk up the aisle with the book instead of flowers, showed that full, rare smile all the way to the back of the church. They spoke the words of the ceremony with the same precision they brought to everything else, clearly and without performance. And when it was done, and the minister pronounced them married, and Phineas kissed her with a thoroughness that made several people in the front pews find things to look at on the ceiling, Dora Pickwell clasped her hands together and said, "Finally," at a volume only slightly below what she intended. They set up house in a small but solid adobe on the north side of town that Phineas had negotiated a purchase on before Christmas from a family moving to Colorado. He modified it over the first weeks of their marriage with the same methodical competence he brought to everything, fixing the roof where it leaked, rehanging a door that had always sat crooked, building a proper set of bookshelves along the main room wall for Lydia's considerable accumulation of books. The bookshelves were a gift of a particular kind. He built them over 3 days while she was teaching, and the first time she walked into the house and saw them, floor to ceiling on the long wall, with her books already arranged on them in the order she kept them in her mind, she stood in the doorway for a moment that was longer than she would admit and felt something in her chest that she could only describe as a place fitting into itself. She turned around and he was watching her from the kitchen doorway, with a look of slightly guarded hope. "How did you know the order?" she said. "I watched you with the books for 2 months," he said. "The history on the left, then the law books, then the science, then the literature. The poetry at the right end closest to the window." She crossed the room and kissed him with a warmth that was proportional to what the shelves meant, which was to say it was rather thoroughly expressive of the full significance of the gesture, and he seemed to consider this a satisfactory response. They worked well together in that first year, in all the dimensions that word implies. She taught school. He built a practice that was part range detective work, part legal counsel for landowners who could not afford an actual attorney, which was most of them, a use of his knowledge of territorial law that expanded steadily as his reputation in the county grew. He was not an attorney and did not pretend to be one, but he was careful and thorough and honest about the limits of what he could advise, and the work he did within those limits was genuinely useful. Lydia, in the evenings, continued her own reading in the law books that she had accumulated, and on several occasions when a case Phineas was working on turned on a specific point of territorial statute, she would read out the relevant section to him from memory at the kitchen table while he made notes, and this private collaboration was one of the things they both held most closely. This working together in the lamplight with the law between them, both of them bringing what they had. Different and complementary, neither reduced by the presence of the other. In the spring of 1885, the certified duplicate of the Culver County record books that Lydia had completed was formally presented to the county and filed as an official archived copy in the courthouse, alongside the original volumes. The covering documentation, written by Lydia and notarized by the Territorial Land Office, described the circumstances of its creation and the legal precedent it established for the use of witness documentary testimony in record reconstruction cases. The Territorial Attorney General's office in Santa Fe requested a copy for their own archive. Alderman Fitch, at the small ceremony marking the filing, gave a speech in which he described Lydia's contribution as visionary and indispensable, a phrase which was both accurate and represented a considerably further revision of his original position than Lydia had expected he would ever travel, and she accepted it graciously without noting the journey. Phineas stood beside her at the ceremony with his hand at the small of her back, a light touch, and she leaned into it by precisely the degree that was both natural and enough. Also in the spring of 1885, Lydia discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Phineas on a Sunday morning, matter-of-factly, over the breakfast table. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. His face did the thing where it was very still, and the stillness was not blankness but depth, a great deal happening underneath a composed surface. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am entirely well," she said. "I expect to continue teaching until the autumn." He nodded. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they stayed like that for a long moment, the coffee going slightly cold, and the morning light coming through the window onto the table where they had spent so many evenings with books and papers between them, and the quiet was very full. The baby came in October of 1885, a boy, healthy and loud, and possessed from the very first week of an observational focus that made Dora Pickwell, who came to help with the lying in and stayed longer than she technically needed to, declare that he had his mother's eyes in a sense that went beyond the physical. They named him James Gerald Shepard, James for no one in particular and Gerald for old Gerald Matties, who had kept the records that Lydia had memorized, and who, when informed of the naming by a letter she wrote to him in Albuquerque, wrote back a response of such touching gratitude that Phineas read it twice, and then folded it very carefully and put it in the family Bible. Lydia went back to teaching 6 weeks after James was born, which caused moderate scandal among the more conventional women of Culver, and no scandal at all among the ranching families, who understood that when a person with a valuable skill is available to teach your children, you do not interfere with the circumstances that make that available. Phineas managed James's care between his own work hours with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and the baby, transported frequently to both the schoolroom and the county courthouse depending on which parents' work the day required, grew up with an early familiarity with legal documents and arithmetic primers that seemed, given his parentage, entirely appropriate. The Hargrove matter, as a legal case, continued to work its way through the territorial court system for 2 more years after the initial confrontation. Cyrus Hargrove himself was never convicted of criminal fraud because he had enough political connections in Santa Fe to ensure that the charges against him were managed down to a civil finding and a substantial fine, which was the particular justice available to men of his resources and influence. Phineas stated his opinion of this outcome with a precision and economy that managed, in fewer words than a longer speech would have required, to convey everything that needed to be said about it. Lydia wrote a piece for the Albuquerque newspaper about the territorial land adjudication procedures and the specific legal vulnerabilities that cases like the Hargrove filing exploited, using the Culver case as its primary example. The piece was read in Santa Fe and contributed to a legislative amendment that closed 2 of the most significant of those vulnerabilities in 1887. She received no official credit for the amendment. Phineas knew who had written it and told her so, and that was sufficient. 2 years after James, in the autumn of 1887, Lydia had their second child, a daughter they named Clara Frances Shepard, a bright and vivid child who was walking by the time she was 10 months old and talking by 12, at which point she became, as Phineas noted with a dry accuracy that made Lydia laugh in the kitchen. The most talkative person in a house that already contained a schoolteacher and an unusual volume of information. Clara grew up wanting to ride horses, specifically, with a focused passion that was entirely her own, and that her father encouraged with patient consistency, and her mother supported by not discouraging it, which in the territory of 1887 and beyond required a certain active resistance to the conventional opinion about what a small girl's appropriate activities were. By the time Clara was 4, she could sit a walking horse without assistance, and Phineas taught her with the same deliberate, methodical attention he brought to everything. And Lydia watched from the fence rail with a pride that was complicated and uncomplicated at once. Pride in the child and pride in the father, and pride in the particular life they had built together in this Red Mesa country at the edge of what was still the frontier. James, 3 years older than Clara, went through a phase at age 6 of attempting to memorize things in the manner of his mother, reciting the names of the states and territories and their capitals in alphabetical order, which he did reasonably well, and the contents of the general store's main shelf in the order they were stocked, which he did extremely well. His memory was not his mother's, not the absolute perfect retention that was Lydia's specific gift, but it was notably excellent, and the first time she watched him demonstrate it without prompting, she sat very still for a moment with an expression that Phineas, who was watching her, understood completely. "He is remarkable," she said later quietly. "He comes by it honestly," Phineas said. She looked at him. "He comes by it from you as well, that patience, that careful observation." He considered this for a moment. "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. He smiled at her, the full one, and she smiled back, and James, who was 7 and pretending not to watch his parents from the doorway, decided that adults were very strange but that these 2 particular ones were the right kind. By 1889, the year New Mexico Territory continued its long approach to statehood that would not be completed until 1912. Culver had grown. 300 more people in 5 years, a second school on the south side of town, a proper bank, a telegraph office, a doctor who had trained in Philadelphia and whose presence significantly reduced the mortality rate of difficult births, which was a change of incalculable importance for every family in the county. The railroad was coming, everyone said. It would be south of them through the bigger towns, but the spur would reach Culver eventually. The frontier was narrowing. Lydia taught the first school for 23 years, from 1880 to 1903, when she retired to write the comprehensive history of Culver County that she had been collecting materials for since her first year in the territory. The history was published in 1907 by a press in Albuquerque and was notable for its precise documentation of the 1883 land records crisis and the legal precedent it established, as well as for the quality of its prose and the extraordinary specificity of its detail regarding land use, water rights, and the daily lives of the farming and ranching families who had built the county. It dedicated the chapter on the crisis to the memory of Gerald Matties, who had died in 1891. Phineas built his practice slowly and well over the course of the years. By 1895, he was handling more work than he could manage alone, and had taken on a young man named Davis Morrow as a junior partner, training him in the range law and property work with the same patience and thoroughness that characterized everything he did. By the time James Shepard was 18 and interested in the law himself, the practice had a name on the door and a reputation across 3 counties, and James went to study in Albuquerque and came back with a proper certificate and joined his father's practice in 1903, the same year his mother retired from teaching. On the evening of that particular confluence, when both those transitions had been formally established and the children were adults, and the house was quiet in the way that a house full of people has earned the right to be quiet, Phineas and Lydia sat together on the front porch of the adobe house, which had been expanded twice over the years to accommodate children and books and the general expansiveness of two lives lived fully, and they watched the sun go down over the mesa. She leaned against his shoulder, which she had been doing for 20 years and which never once felt ordinary. "Do you remember," he said, "what you told them in that commission meeting about the 1875 agreement?" "I remember everything," she said, "including that." He was quiet for a moment. "I think that was the moment I understood that I was in serious trouble." "Trouble," she said, "the kind you don't want to get out of." She tilted her head back and looked up at the sky, which was doing the extravagant desert thing with the color above the mesa, crimson and orange and a deep luminous gold, the kind of sky that made the territory worth the difficulty of living in it. "I think," she said, "that I began to understand the same thing when you built the bookshelves." "Not before," he said, with the slight edge of amusement that she had spent 20 years being glad to hear. "The commission meeting was professionally impressive," she said. "The bookshelves were personally devastating." He laughed, a genuine, comfortable sound, and she turned her head to look at him in the last of the light. 21 years in this country, 2 children, hundreds of evenings like this one, and he was still the same face that had watched her across a long table and chosen to test her fairly instead of dismiss her. And she was still the person who had read 412 entries from memory and was glad of it, because without that gift, and without that night, and without the theft that had called it forward, she would never have been sitting on this porch in the last of this particular light, with this particular man. She thought about hidden motives and betrayal and the traps that fear and greed set for ordinary lives, and she thought about how the town had been rescued from a dark manipulation by the simple fact of a mind that could hold things exactly as they were. And she thought about how the rescue had, as these things sometimes do, opened a door to something she had not known to hope for. "Phineas," she said. "Thank you for testing me," she said. "That first morning, with the Sutton entry." He looked at her. "I needed to know." "I know," she said. "That's exactly why I'm thanking you." He understood what she meant. That he had tested her the way you test a thing you hope is real, with the honest and slightly terrifying willingness to find out that it isn't. And she had been real, completely and without reduction, and he had updated his understanding immediately and completely, without resistance, because he was a man whose relationship to truth was absolute. That was why she had married him, among other things. He put his arm around her and she stayed in it, and the sky went on being extraordinary above the mesas. And inside the house, Clara could be heard talking to James about something with the frank and energetic certainty of a young woman who has never once been discouraged from having opinions, which was entirely by design. The stars came out above the territory in their usual unstinting abundance, the way they did in country that had not yet filled in with enough lamplight to dim them, and they sat together until the air turned cool, and the light was entirely gone. And then they went inside, to the house that was full of books and children and the accumulated materials of a life built together in a hard and beautiful country, and Lydia closed the door behind them. The record books of Culver County were still in the courthouse, both the originals and the certified duplicate that bore the date of 1885 and the notation that it had been reconstructed from the testimony of Lydia Talmadge Shepard, schoolteacher, through her complete and verified recollection of every entry. Both copies were still in excellent condition. Both would survive into the next century and beyond, consulted by historians and legal scholars, and in the 1970s, by a graduate student writing a thesis on informal legal practices in territorial New Mexico, who would describe the 1883 Culver County crisis as one of the most remarkable instances of human memory serving as primary legal evidence in American territorial history. She would not know about the graduate student, but she would have thought it perfectly reasonable. James Shepard married a young woman named Annie Caldwell from Las Cruces in 1906, and their first child, born in 1907, was a boy they named Phineas Gerald Shepard II, which caused the original Phineas to receive the news at the breakfast table with a stillness of expression that lasted 3 full seconds before he looked at his wife and said, "That was not necessary," in a voice that was somewhat less steady than usual. "James disagrees," she said, with complete composure and a happiness she made no effort to conceal. Clara Shepard, who had grown into exactly the horsewoman her early interest had promised, married a rancher from the eastern part of the county in 1908, a solid, capable man named Thomas Aldridge, who was somewhat in awe of his mother-in-law in a way that never entirely resolved itself, and that everyone in the family found quietly entertaining. By 1910, Phineas and Lydia Shepard had 3 grandchildren and a 4th expected in the spring. The adobe house had been expanded a 3rd time to accommodate the frequency of family visits, and the bookshelf on the long wall had been joined by 2 additional shelves on the opposite wall, and a freestanding case in the corner that held Lydia's research materials for the county history. On a Sunday in March of 1910, with the family gathered for the midday meal around the long table that had replaced the boarding house parlor as the center of their domestic world, and with the voices of children in the yard and the smell of beans and cornbread from the kitchen and the sound of James and Thomas disagreeing about water rights in the comfortable way of men who agree about most things, Lydia sat at the head of the table and looked down its length at Phineas, who was at the other end listening to his granddaughter, who was 4 years old and explaining something about a beetle she had found. He was listening to the beetle explanation with his full attention and complete seriousness, which was the only way he listened to anything, and the child was responding to this attention with the expansive confidence of a small person who has been listened to properly. Lydia watched him, and she thought, as she sometimes allowed herself to think, about the night the record books were stolen, and the morning she had walked into the courthouse and the long table and the test and all of it, every entry in sequence, every date and boundary description and witnessing signature, leading forward through itself to this room and this light and this man at the end of her table listening to a small child explain a beetle. Everything in sequence, everything exactly as it was. She would not have changed a single entry. Outside the kitchen window, the mesas were red in the morning light as they had always been, as they would go on being, permanent and patient above the lives that moved through the country below them, none of which were simple, and all of which were, in their way, remarkable. Phineas looked up from the beetle explanation and met her eyes across the length of the table, and the look that passed between them was the same look it had always been, since the courthouse and the creek bed and the parlor and all the years between, the look of 2 people who know exactly what they have and have the particular grace of knowing it while they have it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then very slightly he smiled. She smiled back, unhurried and full with the easy warmth of a woman who is exactly where she chose to be and has never once regretted the choice. The family dinner went on around them, loud and various and full of life, and outside the window of the house they had built together, the territory went on being itself, vast and demanding and indifferent to small human concerns, and they went on being equal to it. Every entry in order, every one of them exactly right.